A century ago, the world-famous masterpiece Lady Chatterley's Lover burst onto the scene. Because it ripped away the fig leaf of humanity's spiritual impotence, it was collectively banned by the entire civilized world for 30 long years. Right at the opening of the book, its author, D.H. Lawrence, left a chilling prophecy that still gives goosebumps to later generations. Ours is essentially a tragic age, so we refuse to take it tragically. In the England of 1920, inside Ragby Hall, the noble Sir Clifford Chatterley was holding court in a magnificent parlor, passionately debating philosophy and capital with the cleverest elites of all Britain. Yet everyone implicitly pretended to be blind to one glaring fact: this young, wealthy baronet, whose mind was consumed by modern industrial ambition, had been completely paralyzed from the waist down by the gunfire of World War I, turning into a living corpse, stripped of all vital biological instincts. In this manor house, blackened by coal smoke, a young woman named Connie, Lady Chatterley herself, sat by a wide, cold oak window, experiencing the countless silent suffocations of her life. That year, she was in her 20s, healthy and voluptuous, with a pair of eager, yet gradually dimming brown eyes. In the circle of self-proclaimed noble intellectuals around her, whose mouths were filled with existentialism and economic interests, this free-thinking woman was the widely envied Lady Chatterley. Her husband, Clifford Chatterley, was a typical new-generation British aristocrat. He was young, wealthy, highly educated, and originally a literary man full of promise. However, a single blast from the First World War not only sent the youth of all Europe into the muddy trenches, but also shattered Clifford's destiny entirely. He returned from the battlefield bearing a chest full of medals, but also a ruined torso completely paralyzed from the waist down. He was confined for life to a wheeled oak chair, becoming a living dead man whose lower half had completely perished. The disaster wrought by this war was not merely physical, but spiritual. Clifford's paralysis became the ultimate metaphor for the post-Dubaliai Western civilization, and indeed the British ruling class, hollow, arrogant, with an infinitely developed intellect, but completely impotent in humanity's most primal, core vital life force and sexual instinct. Did Connie love Clifford? In the beginning, it was a sublime love built on pure spirit, intellect, and class identification. Connie accompanied Clifford back to the ancient Ragby Hall, playing the part of an impeccable aristocratic wife. Every afternoon, she pushed Clifford's heavy wheelchair as they strolled down the deathly silent avenues of the estate. At night, Ragby's parlor would gather the brightest young talents in Britain, sipping expensive brandy, smoking cigars, and engaging in hours of metaphysical debates. In those brilliant, empty conversations, Clifford's mind appeared incredibly sharp. He began writing novels and gained a reputation in the literary magazines of Paris and London. Using his highly developed intellect, he proved to Connie and to everyone else that humanity had transcended the crude physical stage. Spiritual communion were the highest values of living. He even told Connie that physical relations are but a fleeting, vulgar habit, and that their spiritual fusion was the true eternal marriage. Connie accepted this theory. She forced herself to believe in the omnipotence of the spirit, turning herself into a tireless instrument, caring for her husband's medicine-scented body by day, and revising his cold, exquisite manuscript drafts at the typewriter by night. She thought this was nobility. She thought this was the grand life modern civilization bestowed upon women. Yet, while humanity's watches can be synchronized by machines, the body's instincts can never be deceived by the intellect. As spring faded and summer arrived, Connie discovered that her body was undergoing a terrifying, irreversible decay. In that magnificent yet lifeless bedroom at Ragby Hall, when she stood before the mirror gazing at her naked flesh, she felt a skin-crawling dread. Her skin, which once glowed with the radiance of a mature woman, began to grow pale and slack. Her eyes lost their former luster, and her breasts withered in silence. This was not due to aging. It was a spiritual starvation caused by a lack of love, a lack of touch, and a lack of vital life force to nourish her. She lived her days in a tomb paved with marble and carpets. The whirring sound of Clifford's wheelchair rolling down the hallway became the cruelest death knell of her life. The more Clifford succeeded in literature and industrial management using his sharp intellect, the more Connie felt like a zombie drained of blood and flesh. The chattering intellectuals around her spoke the most beautiful philosophical words, but their eyes were dead and their bodies were rigid. Connie suddenly saw through this scam of modern civilization. These people had castrated their own bodies, built a cage of steel and cement with rationality and money, and sat inside it, hypocritically praising the purity of the spirit. At this critical precipice, just as Connie's spirit was on the verge of a total collapse, that ancient forest, surrounded by iron gates at Ragby Hall, sent her a faint, primitive whisper from millennia ago. It was a remnant of a natural oak forest, the only pure land in this town thoroughly polluted by industrial coal smoke, a place not yet trampled by coal mine tracks and steam locomotives. To escape the suffocating parlor talk of the manor and flee from Clifford's omnipresent spiritual control, Connie began to walk alone into this dim forest. And it was here, on the soft earth carpeted with thick fallen leaves, that she encountered the keeper of that forest, the gamekeeper, Oliver Mellors. Mellors was a commoner raised in the Midland coalfields. He had been a blacksmith's apprentice and had served as a lieutenant in the British Army during the World War. On the battlefield, he had witnessed the hypocrisy of the ruling class and the stupidity of the rank-and-file soldiers, conceiving a deep loathing for this modern society ruled by machines and money. Consequently, after the war, he voluntarily relinquished his officer status, rejected any chance of climbing to a higher social stratum, and hid alone in this deep forest of the Chatterley estate. Wearing rough homespun keeper's velvet, he made a living watching over the baronet's pheasants and driving off poachers. He lived like a solitary beast, cold, silent, harboring a primal hostility and contempt for anyone from the upper classes. That afternoon, having lost her way, Connie inadvertently stumbled upon the gamekeeper's hut deep in the woods. Beside a rustic wooden coop used for hatching young chicks, she saw Mellors kneeling on the ground, using a pair of calloused, yet incredibly tender hands to carefully cradle a newly hatched pheasant chick. That gentle image of life's primal birth, something long extinct in the cold modern world, viciously struck Connie's withered heart in an instant. Hearing a sound, Mellors stood up. He looked at the melancholic lady before him, dressed in an expensive silk gown. He did not bow like a provincial peasant. There was not a trace of servility in his eyes, nor the hypocritical flattery found in Parisian salons. They were eyes belonging to the forest, to the soil, even to a lone wolf of the wilderness, sharp, cold, bearing a naked scrutiny of class privilege. While Julian Sorel sought to conquer aristocrats through Bible recitations and masquerades, Mellors confronted this world with absolute refusal and a return to nature. Speaking in a broad, coarse provincial dialect, Mellors gave a chilly nod to Lady Chatterley, his tone dripping with subtext, "This is my forest, this is the domain of life. You impotent nobles living in Ragby Hall, do not soil my dirt with your suffocating coal smoke and hypocrisy." Connie stood there, flustered and uneasy. She ought to have been furious at this subordinate's insolence, but strangely, as she looked at Mellors' broad shoulders and his body radiating the vitality of sweat and earth from long manual labor, she felt an unprecedented, almost shivering primal instinct of life. She realized that the aura radiating from this gamekeeper was something that all the brandy in Ragby Hall, all the philosophical books, and all of Clifford's accolades combined could never provide. It was the scent of being truly alive. It was a humid afternoon when Connie returned to the forest. She sat in the wooden hut, watching the fragile chicks. The despair of her existence, the hunger of her flesh, and her long-standing spiritual exhaustion instantly dissolved into uncontrollable tears, flowing freely down her cheeks. She crouched on the ground, weeping like a child lost in a wasteland. Mellors, who was working, put down his axe. He walked silently behind this noble woman. He looked at her back, which heaved violently with her sobs, full of the voluptuous curves of a mature woman. At that moment, transcending the hatred of class and the barriers of sex, a magnificent sympathy and instinct from the dawn of humanity, from the primeval universe, completely awakened in the gamekeeper's blood. He slowly squatted down, stretching out his calloused hand, stained with wood shavings and dirt, and gently, tremblingly placed it on Connie's pale, cold shoulder. Connie shuddered violently. This was no intellectual, controlling probe like Clifford's. This was the hand of a flesh and blood man. The scorching heat radiating from that palm was like a high-voltage current, shattering in an instant all the false armor built around her by modern civilization, aristocratic breeding, and religious taboos. She turned around to meet Mellors' eyes, which were no longer cold, but burning with an ablaze, fierce fire. There were no superfluous words, no intellectual teasing of a Parisian salon, and no provincial moral wrestling. Deep inside this primeval forest, far removed from industrial coal smoke, on the soft, damp soil that exhaled the scent of green grass and humus, two souls and bodies, marginalized and battered to pieces by modern civilization, clashed fiercely in the most primitive, naked, and sacred way imaginable. It was the first time in Connie's life that she experienced what true sex and true love meant. It was not the crude, vulgar elimination that Clifford spoke of. It was the ultimate explosion of life energy, the complete resurrection of the soul within the ultimate tremor of the flesh. As Mellors' powerful body carried her into the stratosphere, Connie heard the cells within her own body, dead for so many years, erupting in a Genesis-like cheer. She was no longer Lady Chatterley. She stripped off that hypocritical aristocratic title and, at this moment, became a daughter of nature. And for the gamekeeper Mellors, this noblewoman's body was not a tool for class revenge either. He harbored none of Julian Sorel's twisted hubris. In Connie's unreserved, genuine tremors, this lonely beast, who had grown completely despondent with human civilization and shut himself in the deep woods, felt the tenderness of being understood and accepted for the first time. In his desolate world, because of this woman's arrival, the first green leaf sprouted. The two lay panting on a bed paved with fallen leaves. Towering oaks surrounded them as the ancient forest silently sheltered these adulterers who, in the eyes of the secular world, were guilty of heinous sins. They looked at each other's bodies, devoid of shame or guilt, filled only with a sacred, solemn reverence akin to a religious ritual. Little did they know that the heavy wheelchair of Ragby Hall, bearing all the greed and cruelty of modern mechanical civilization, was rolling toward this last virgin forest, relentlessly crushing forward, step by step. In that magnificent sitting room of Ragby Hall, when Connie stepped across the threshold again, carrying the heavy dampness of the woods and the fragrance of the soil, she was confronted by an even more terrifying Clifford. By this time, Clifford was no longer content with writing exquisite, cold novels for magazines in Paris and London. His paralysis and the sexual impotence emanating from his very bones mutated into a deeply pathological craving for power in the face of brutal reality. He turned his gaze to the Tevershall coal mine right beneath the estate. He said to himself, "Since my lower body is dead, since I cannot possess a woman or carry on my lineage like a normal man, I will conquer this land with my brain. I will use steel, machinery, and the blood and sweat of hundreds of low-class miners to forge an industrial empire that belongs to me, Clifford." He began to obsessively study coal mining technology, corporate management, and capital operations. He had his servants modify his wheelchair into a beast driven by a modern electric motor, equipped with tracks and heavy iron wheels. Every morning, sitting in that buzzing electric wheelchair, he barged through the carpets of the manor and the coal-dusted roads of the mining district. With an almost cold rationality, he docked the miners' wages, imported the latest crushing machines, and let the coal mine chimneys spew blacker, deadlier smoke. In Clifford's eyes, those living miners were not human beings. They were merely parts extending the mechanical arms, numbers creating capital. He once sat in his wheelchair and said to Connie, with an infinitely developed, patronizing, aristocratic rationality, "This world is destined to be ruled by a few intelligent elites. The working classes at the bottom are like cogs in a machine. They don't need thoughts, they don't need happiness, they only need to obey. And we are the levers that control this massive apparatus." Looking at this husband sitting in his buzzing electric chair, Connie felt an unprecedented wave of nausea and coldness. She realized that Clifford had completely transformed into a mechanical monster, assembled from steel, wires, and ambition. The faster his mind raced and the more overbearing his spirit became, the more his vital human life force withered away. Ragby Hall was no longer a home. It had become a massive concentration camp ruled by cold rationality, and she was its most exquisite inmate. It was precisely within this near desperate suffocation that Connie fled to that dim forest with increasing frequency. For her, that muddy path leading to the keeper's hut was not a road to sinful trysting, but her only escape hatch where she could breathe the vital air of life. On that summer afternoon, under rolling thunder and a torrential downpour, Connie returned to the deep woods once more. Dark clouds carpeted the sky, and raindrops the size of beans slapped violently against the ancient oak leaves, washing the entire forest until it exhaled a wild, primeval fragrance. Naked to the waist, the gamekeeper Mellors was repairing the pheasant coops in the heavy rain. His skin glistened with a healthy bronze sheen under the lashing downpour. His firm muscles tensed with his movements as rainwater coursed freely down his chest and abdominal muscles. At that moment, watching Mellors in the heavy rain, the primal life instinct inside Connie, which had been ruthlessly suppressed by modern civilization for over 20 years, completely burst its banks in an instant. She didn't seek shelter. Instead, facing the sky full of pouring rain, she dashed into the deluge with a roaring laugh. She tore off her expensive silk gown that signified her noble status, ripped away the exquisite undergarments binding her body, exposing herself unreservedly and nakedly to the storm and thunder. Mellors turned his head, watching the baronet's wife running naked through the rain, laughing like a wild witch. In the eyes of this man who was utterly disillusioned by human civilization and had locked himself in the deep woods, Connie was no longer an unattainable aristocratic symbol. She was the earth itself, the primordial eve of life. Devoid of secular hesitation or class calculations, the two launched into a frantic carnal ecstasy on the soft, damp forest floor, carpeted with the fresh scent of soil and fallen leaves, washed clean of all the coal smoke of modern civilization. They rolled in the heavy rain, letting the freezing rainwater and scalding sweat fuse into one. They wove wild flowers and green leaves from the forest into garlands, decorating each other's naked torsos. It was the highest praise of the body, a deeply sacred religious ritual dedicated to sex. Here, the sexual instinct was endowed by Lawrence with a magnificent power to destroy all hypocritical civilizations. As Mellors' body repeatedly propelled Connie to the peaks of life, she felt that the humiliations she suffered at Ragby Hall and the dead rationality Clifford had hammered into her were entirely washed away by this storm. Lying in Mellors' arms, feeling the burning, authentic thumping of this commoner's chest, she said to herself, "This is what it means to be alive. Even if tomorrow is the end of the world, even if I must walk to the scaffold for this, I absolutely will never return to that impotent, freezing world of the dead." Yet, in this reality, firmly governed by steel and money, pure natural love was destined to face the most brutal reckoning. Fire can never be wrapped in paper. The seemingly dead circle of Ragby Hall, forged from class prejudice and conventional morality, began to ripple with malicious gossip. In order to throw himself entirely into his coal mining empire, Clifford hired a widow named Mrs. Bolton from the outside to serve as his private nurse. This Mrs. Bolton was an extremely clever, worldly, and human nature savvy, lower-class provincial woman. In the process of caring for Clifford's ruined torso, she used her tenderness, her compliance, and her familiarity with the gossip of the mining district to win his absolute trust step by step. She became another crutch for Clifford, this time a spiritual one. Through Mrs. Bolton's eyes, Clifford began to touch the secrets of the underclass that he usually disdained, but it was also through Mrs. Bolton's mouth that various rumors about Lady Chatterley frequently entering the forest late at night, and about that eccentric gamekeeper Mellors, began to slither into Clifford's sharp ears like the fork of a venomous snake. At first, this haughty British baronet refused to believe this preposterous rumor. Within Clifford's deep-rooted aristocratic logic, even if Connie were to have an affair, she ought to choose someone like them, a highly educated, elegantly spoken Parisian writer, or a London politician. How could his wife, the noble Lady Chatterley, become involved with a subordinate covered in mud, who spoke in a vulgar dialect, a watchdog he paid to keep? That was not just a betrayal of marriage. It was a ruinous humiliation to the lineage of the Chatterley family and their class dignity. However, a turning point of fate descended with spectacular irony one afternoon. That afternoon, Clifford insisted on showing Connie his newly modified, highly powerful electric wheelchair. He ordered Connie to push him into that ancient oak forest he rarely set foot in. This product of modern industry buzzed loudly as it rolled over ancient roots, ruthlessly crushing the soft fallen leaves and wild flowers on the ground into dust. Clifford sat atop it, a triumphant conqueror's smirk plastered across his face. Yet, when the wheelchair reached a steep slope deep in the forest, the ground was so damp and soft that the heavy iron wheels sank deeply into a bog. The electric motor emitted a piercing, desperate whine, sending up plumes of white smoke, but the tracks merely spun in place, completely unable to budge. Clifford's previously overbearing pride dissolved in an instant into the distinct hysteria of a disabled man. He cursed frantically, commanding Connie to use all her strength from behind to push this heavy engine of steel. Connie's slender frame struggled in the mud, her shoes sank into the mire, and her silk clothes were torn by branches. But no matter how hard she tried, that chair, signifying the impotent essence of modern civilization, remained stubbornly wedged deep in the bog. Just as Clifford's rage and meltdown reached their zenith, the gamekeeper Mellors, dressed in rough velvet homespun and holding an axe, emerged from the depths of the trees with a face as cold as ice. Clifford, as if seeing a savior, barked at Mellors in his habitual master-to-servant tone. "Mellors, where the devil have you been? Get over here and use your brute strength to push my chair out." Mellors said nothing. His eyes, belonging to a lone wolf, first glanced at Connie, mud-splattered, disheveled, yet possessing crystal-clear eyes, and then slowly shifted to Clifford sitting in the chair, whose upper torso looked exceptionally bloated and grotesque due to his paralyzed legs. In that split second, at the center of this ancient primeval forest, the gazes of the three clashed violently in the air, forming the most profound and brutal metaphor in literary history. One represented a ruling class with an advanced intellect and state-of-the-art technology, yet utterly impotent in biology and life force. Another was a rebel with a sound physical body who had returned to nature, yet was marginalized and viewed as a watchdog in modern society. And sandwiched between them was the modern woman who, in the life-or-death struggle between spirit and flesh, ultimately chose life and nature. Mellors stepped forward silently. He bent down, and with those calloused, powerful arms that had given Connie infinite climaxes and salvation, he gripped the iron frame of the wheelchair with a death stare. His muscles bunched beneath his rough clothes, and a heavy, low growl, like a beast stalking its prey, escaped his throat. Thud! With a violent wrench, Mellors used his raw, earth-derived physical strength to forcibly yank this stuck monster of modern steel right out of the mud. Clifford sat in the restarted wheelchair without a single word of thanks. He merely stared with a suspicious, guarded, and almost instinctively terrified gaze at this gamekeeper radiating the smell of heat and sweat. Deep in the heart of this calculating aristocrat, a seed of venomous suspicion had finally sprouted. Watching Mellors dust off the grime from his hands and turn away arrogantly, Clifford realized for the first time that this lowly employee possessed a power he could never buy with all his money and status, the absolute privilege of life. Upon returning to the estate, Clifford immediately mobilized Mrs. Bolton and all his informants in the mining district to launch a seamless, trace-free encirclement against the gamekeeper. Meanwhile, Connie discovered that she had made a decision that would drive the entire upper echelon of society absolutely insane. She was pregnant. She was carrying the gamekeeper's child, the flesh and blood of a commoner, a wild man who, in the eyes of the aristocracy, was lower than a machine part. When Connie broke the news to Mellors, the man who had spent his life fleeing the civilized world and living like a lone wolf showed a flash of immense bewilderment and fear in his eyes for the first time. But immediately after, that fear was supplanted by a deeper, grander sense of paternal responsibility. He took Connie's hand and said to her, Connie, this child is not a product of sin. He is the son of this forest, the only truth we retrieved in the storm and from the soil. Even if this world tries to drown us with all its laws and morals, I will absolutely never let go of your hand. They decided to lay their cards on the table, to wage a final war against that dead, decaying aristocratic marriage. When Connie stood calmly before Clifford's electric wheelchair and told him word for word that she no longer loved him, was pregnant with the gamekeeper Oliver Mellors' child, and intended to file for divorce, the air inside Ragby Hall seemed to freeze completely in an instant. Clifford's originally pale, refined face contorted in a flash of extreme rage and humiliation. He gripped the armrests of his wheelchair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He didn't weep, nor did he rage like an ordinary husband. Instead, he roared in a near subhuman, bone-chilling voice. "Divorce? Don't even dream of it. You shameless woman. You have betrayed your class. You have actually debased your own body to cling to a beast of the forest. You can pack your bags, you can go anywhere, but I, Sir Clifford Chatterley, will never sign a single letter on this divorce agreement, even if it costs me all my wealth and reputation. I will ensure your child remains a nameless bastard for life, and I will ensure you two adulterers who violated the civilized order are pinned to the pillar of societal shame forever." Following Clifford's near-manic refusal, an invisible strangulation, orchestrated by the entire British high society, the legal system, and conventional morality, lunged viciously at the star-crossed lovers. Mellors was fired immediately, driven out of the ancient forest he had guarded for years. The miners in the town, incited by Mrs. Bolton, scribbled the filthiest locker-room jokes about the gamekeeper and the baronet's wife on the walls. Mellors' coarse, long-estranged ex-wife seized the opportunity to leap into the fray, accusing Mellors in courts and newspapers of being a vulgar scoundrel who seduced noble women and abandoned his family. Amidst the sweeping wave of condemnation and mud, Mellors and Connie were forced apart. Mellors had to leave Nottinghamshire, fleeing under an assumed name to a remote farm in southern England, to become a low-class farmhand again, earning meager wages through the heaviest manual labor in the fields while waiting for the storm to blow over. Meanwhile, Connie took her swelling belly and hid in her sister's house in Scotland, enduring the invisible cold shoulders and reprimands from within her family. This was a spiritual lynching, far more agonizing and drawn out than Julian Sorel's scaffold. In this modern society, ruled by machinery and capital, if you rebel against it, it won't slice off your head with a blade. It will use invisible social isolation, legal lawsuits, and economic blockades as a whetstone, grinding down your passion day after day until you are remolded into a compliant, numb component. On the final New Year's Eve of the 1920s, snow fell thick and fast, blanketing the industrial ruins and coal mine chimneys of all England in a blinding, harsh white. In that drafty, rustic stone hut on the southern farm, the gamekeeper Mellors sat by a dim oil lamp, using those hands etched with calluses and vicissitudes to write to Connie in far-off Scotland, penning one of the most tender, epic love letters in literary history. He wrote, "My dear Connie, the world outside is dying. Those people sitting in wheelchairs and offices are turning humanity into zombies with their machines and money. But I don't care anymore, because I know that far away in the north, inside your belly, the tiny life we conceived in the forest and amidst the heavy rain is thumping. That is the sole spark in this impotent age that has not yet been contaminated. This spring, when the little fellow in your womb is born, I will find a way to scrape together enough money to buy a small plot of land. We will have a little log cabin of our own, free of coal smoke, free of wheelchairs, with nothing but real earth covered in green grass. We will till with our hands and love with our bodies. The road ahead is long, and the world's punishment for us is far from over. But I believe that as long as the flame of life inside us has not been extinguished, as long as we are still willing to touch and to face each other's bodies with absolute sincerity, we have not lost. Let us wait quietly beneath the winter ice and snow, waiting for the arrival of that spring which truly belongs to life, and the awakening of the flesh. Yours forever, Oliver Mellors." Here, amidst the swirling blizzard and the dim glow of the oil lamp, the curtain slowly fell on the script. A century has passed. The wheels of history have rolled past the year 2026. The Tevershaw coal mine of yesteryear has long since been reduced to ruins, and Ragby Hall has turned into a cold museum for tourists to inspect. Yet, whenever the night deepens, when we look at those modern youths exhausted in the cubicles of contemporary metropolises, forced to sever their spirits from their flesh for the sake of promotions and raises, suffering from spiritual impotence and extreme internal burnout amidst corporate doublespeak and virtual social networks. We always see our own dying husks inside this highly controversial masterpiece. Under the scrutiny of conventional morality, we often wag our fingers at Connie's betrayal and Mellors' coarseness. Yet in the dead of night, when facing our own bodies that lack love and touch, gradually drying up, we shed the exact same tears of despair as Connie. With a deathly silent estate, a buzzing electric wheelchair, and a primeval forest trembling with the vibrations of life, D.H. Lawrence left a soul-searching question that still rings loud and clear 200 years later to all the modern youth trapped in the cages of technology and capital. When you have exhausted all your options, slipped into the most exquisite shell of modern civilization, and become a social elite whose mind knows everything and whose wallet is bursting with digits, yet you have completely severed the most primitive physical instinct of your human form, forgetting how to love, how to touch, and how to live truthfully in the dirt like a tree. Does this count as the progress of civilization or the absolute impotence of life?